London, 1865. Rain poured relentlessly over the cobblestone streets of Mayfair as Clara Blackwood stood trembling at the entrance of her family's once grand townhouse, watching as the bailiffs carried away the last of their possessions. Her father, the once respected Baron Blackwood, had gambled away their fortune and drowned his sorrows and shame in brandy before taking his own life 3 days prior. The whispers had already spread through London society like wildfire. The Blackwood name was now synonymous with disgrace. Clara clutched the rain-soaked letter in her gloved hand, the ink bleeding through the expensive paper. It was from her uncle, her only living relative, informing her that she was to be married within the fortnight to settle her father's astronomical debts. The groom, none other than Alexander Harrington, the notoriously cold Duke of Westmoreland, a man whose mere presence was said to freeze the air around him, a man who had made his fortune through ruthless business dealings and had never been known to smile. Miss Blackwood, her lady's maid whispered, the only servant who had remained loyal despite not being paid for months. "We must leave now. The landlord has ordered us out by nightfall." Clara nodded numbly, her once vibrant green eyes now dull with resignation. At 22, she had been the belle of 3 London seasons, rejecting countless proposals from gentlemen she did not love, believing that her father's title and modest wealth would afford her the luxury of marrying for affection. How foolish she had been. Now she was to be sold like cattle to a man twice her age, a man who desired not her company, but the valuable shipping routes her father had still owned when the marriage contract was drawn. The cruel irony was that those routes had been lost at the gambling tables merely days after the agreement was signed. The carriage that arrived to collect her was not her uncle's modest vehicle, but an imposing black coach emblazoned with the Westmoreland crest, a snarling wolf with a crown between its teeth. The driver, dressed in the Duke's colours of midnight blue and silver, did not offer assistance as Clara climbed in, her few remaining possessions packed in a single trunk. As the carriage pulled away from the only home she had ever known, Clara allowed herself one moment of weakness, a single tear sliding down her pale cheek. Then she straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and silently vowed that though the Duke of Westmoreland might own her name and her future, he would never possess her spirit. The journey to Westmoreland House took them through the heart of London, past the glittering mansions of Belgravia, where Clara had once attended countless balls and soirees. Now, the windows of those grand houses seemed to watch her passage with cruel amusement. When the carriage finally stopped, Clara peered out at a mansion that seemed more fortress than home, all imposing grey stone and stern lines, with not a single flower to soften its appearance. Our butler, with a face as impassive as the building itself, opened the carriage door. "Miss Blackwood," he intoned, "His Grace awaits you in the library." Clara followed the butler through cavernous hallways adorned with ancestral portraits, each Harrington looking down at her with the same piercing blue eyes, judging, calculating, cold. The library door swung open, and there he stood. The Duke of Westmoreland was not what she had expected. Rather than a grey-haired, portly nobleman, Alexander Harrington was tall and powerfully built, with broad shoulders that his impeccably tailored coat did little to conceal. His hair was the colour of burnished copper, swept back from a face that could have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and stern lines, but it was his eyes that captured her attention, the colour of a winter sky before a storm, and just as merciless. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice deep and devoid of warmth, "I trust your journey was comfortable." It wasn't a question but a statement, as if her comfort was an afterthought, something to be mentioned out of obligation rather than concern. He did not move to greet her properly, remaining behind a massive desk strewn with papers and ledgers, a glass of amber liquid at his elbow. Clara curtsied, hating how her hands trembled. "Your Grace," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "How kind of you to receive me personally." The sarcasm was subtle but unmistakable, and for a moment something flickered in those cold eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that the destitute daughter of a disgraced baron would dare to challenge him, even in such a small way. The Duke's expression remained impassive as he gestured to a chair across from him. "Let us dispense with pleasantries, Miss Blackwood. I have no desire for them, and I suspect you have even less. You are here because your father's debts have left you with no alternatives. I require a wife for reasons of my own. Our arrangement is one of mutual convenience, nothing more." He slid a document across the desk. "These are the terms of our marriage. You will maintain the appearance of a dutiful duchess in public. In private, you will not seek my company nor expect my attention. In return, you will want for nothing material. Your signature, if you please." Clara's fingers hovered over the quill he offered. "And if I refuse, Your Grace?" A cold smile touched his lips but didn't reach his eyes. "Then you are welcome to return to the streets from whence you came. I understand debtor's prison is particularly unpleasant for young women of gentle breeding." Clara took the quill, her hand surprisingly steady as she signed away her future. As she set down the pen, the Duke rose, towering over her. "We will be married tomorrow morning. Private ceremony, no guests. I have business in Scotland that cannot wait. Lady Harrington, my aunt, will show you to your chambers and explain your duties. Good day, Miss Blackwood." He strode from the room without a backward glance, leaving Clara alone with the contract that had just sealed her fate. Only when she was certain he was gone did she allow her shoulders to slump, the weight of her new reality crushing down upon her. "I will survive this," she whispered to herself. "I will endure." Lady Agatha Harrington was everything her nephew was not. Warm, loquacious, and unexpectedly kind. "Pay no mind to Alexander's brusque manner, my dear," she said, as she led Clara up a grand staircase. "The boy has forgotten how to speak to people who aren't ship captains or business associates. Been that way since his parents died in that terrible fire when he was just 15. Raised by ledgers and account books, that one." She patted Clara's hand sympathetically. "Not that it excuses his behavior, mind you. Dukes should know better, title or no title." Clara's chambers were luxurious beyond anything she had experienced, even in her family's better days. A bedroom with a canopied bed draped in sapphire silk, a private sitting room with a view of the gardens, and a dressing room filled with gowns in the latest fashion, all in her size. "His Grace had these made for you," Lady Agatha explained, noticing Clara's confusion. "Say what you will about Alexander, but he's thorough. The man leaves nothing to chance." "Why?" Clara asked, running her fingers over the fine fabrics. "Why arrange a marriage to a woman he clearly disdains? Surely there are more advantageous matches for a duke." Lady Agatha's kind face grew serious. "Because, my dear, Alexander believes in honoring his word. Your father saved his father's life many years ago during a hunting accident. The old duke swore a life debt to Baron Blackwood. When your father approached Alexander 3 months ago, desperate and drowning in debt, he invoked that debt, asking not for money, but for Alexander to protect you after his death. Alexander refused to simply provide for you, said it would invite gossip and ruin your reputation. Marriage was the only honorable solution." She sighed. "I'm afraid my nephew has many qualities, but sentimentality is not among them. He sees this marriage as a duty, nothing more." That night, alone in her new bed, Clara stared at the ceiling and wondered what kind of man would honor a debt so completely, yet treat the payment of it with such cold detachment. The Duke of Westmoreland was a puzzle, and despite her precarious situation, Clara had always enjoyed puzzles. The wedding was as austere as promised. No decorations, no guests, save for Lady Agatha and the Duke's solicitor as witnesses, and no celebration afterward. Clara wore one of her new gowns, a modest creation of pale blue silk that brought out the green of her eyes. The Duke wore black, as if attending a funeral rather than his own wedding. He spoke his vows clearly but mechanically, slid a ring of sapphires and diamonds onto her finger without meeting her gaze, and sealed their union with the briefest touch of his lips against hers, cold and impersonal as a business transaction. When the clergyman pronounced them husband and wife, the Duke merely nodded, as if confirming the completion of an ordinary task. "My carriage leaves for Scotland in an hour," he informed her as they signed the marriage registry. "I shall be gone for at least a month. In my absence, you will begin your duties as Duchess of Westmoreland. Lady Agatha will instruct you." He paused, seeming to search for something more to say, but merely added, "Good day, Duchess," before striding from the small chapel, leaving his new bride staring after him in disbelief. "Did he just leave for a month-long journey immediately after our wedding?" Clara asked Lady Agatha, who merely sighed and patted her hand. "I warned you, my dear. The boy has the social graces of a particularly ill-tempered hedgehog. Come, let's get you home. There's much to learn if you're to take your place in society by the time he returns." The next 4 weeks passed in a whirlwind of lessons and introductions. Clara learned the extensive Westmoreland properties and holdings, the management of a household staff, 3 times larger than her father's had been at its height, and the complex social obligations of a duchess. To her surprise, she found she had a talent for organization and diplomacy. The servants, initially wary of their new mistress, soon warmed to her kind but efficient management style. Even Mr. Winters, the dour butler who had served the Duke since childhood, unbent enough to offer a rare compliment on her handling of a delivery mishap that might have ruined an important dinner. Society, however, proved more challenging. When Clara made her first appearance at Lady Pembroke's musical evening, the whispers began immediately. Fortune hunter, some called her. Desperate to escape her father's shame, others suggested. The cruelest rumors implied that she had trapped the Duke through some scandalous means, forcing his hand. Clara held her head high, smiling politely through the barely veiled insults and pointed questions, but each barb stung nonetheless. It was at one such event, a garden party at the Countess of Blackwood's estate, that Clara encountered Lady Edith Montrose, the woman who, according to gossip, had been the Duke's preferred choice for a bride, before Clara entrapped him. Tall, blonde, and exquisitely beautiful, Lady Edith approached Clara with a smile that didn't reach her cold blue eyes. "Your Grace," she curtsied, her tone making the title sound like an insult. "How unexpected to see you here. I'd heard the Duke married in haste, but I scarcely believed it until now." Clara curtsied in return, her smile equally false. "Lady Edith, is it not? My husband mentioned you—" "Oh, wait. No, he didn't." The shocked gasps from nearby ladies told Clara she had scored a direct hit. Lady Edith's perfect complexion flushed an unflattering shade of red. "How amusing!" Lady Edith recovered quickly. "Tell me, did your father arrange the match before or after he gambled away his family's honor?" Clara felt the blood drain from her face, but before she could respond, a deep voice intervened. "Lady Edith, your mother is looking for you. I believe she wishes to introduce you to Lord Banning's son, something about his estates adjoining your father's hunting grounds." The voice belonged to Lord James Harrington, the Duke's younger brother, whom Clara had yet to meet. Unlike Alexander, James had warm brown eyes and an easy smile, though the family resemblance was unmistakable in the strong jaw and aristocratic nose. Lady Edith had no choice but to excuse herself, though her poisonous glare promised future retribution. "Thank you, my lord," Clara said quietly once Lady Edith was out of earshot. Lord James bowed with a flourish. "James, please, we're family now after all, and no thanks necessary. I've been wanting to meet the woman brave enough to marry my impossible brother. Anyone who can put Edith Montrose in her place is someone I wish to know better." He offered his arm. "Shall we walk? I find gardens much more pleasant than gossips, don't you?" James proved to be delightful company, regaling Clara with stories of his and Alexander's childhood that painted a very different picture of her stern husband. "He wasn't always so unyielding," James explained as they strolled between hedgerows of immaculately trimmed boxwood. "Before our parents died, Alex was actually quite the troublemaker, always climbing trees he shouldn't, challenging authority, laughing loudly enough to scandalize the servants." His smile faded. "The fire changed everything. He was the one who found them, you know. Carried me out himself when the smoke became too much. I was only 10. Afterward, it was as if all the laughter had been burned out of him. At 15, he became the Duke, and the weight of it crushed the boy he had been." Clara felt a pang of sympathy for the young Alexander, thrust into responsibility far too soon. "He never speaks of it," she said. James nodded sadly. "He never speaks of anything that matters. That's Alex's way. Bury the pain. Focus on duty." He gave her a considering look. "You know, you're the first decision he's made in years that wasn't purely practical. Everyone expected him to marry Edith, politically advantageous, socially appropriate, dynastically sound. When he announced he was marrying you instead, half of London nearly collapsed from shock." Clara shook her head in confusion. "But our marriage was practical. My father—" James interrupted with a laugh. "Clara, your father's shipping routes were lost months before the marriage was arranged. Alex knew that perfectly well." He patted her hand where it rested on his arm. "My brother may be many things, but uninformed about business matters is not one of them. Whatever his reasons for marrying you, they weren't the ones he gave." This revelation occupied Clara's thoughts for days afterward. If the Duke hadn't married her for the shipping routes, then why? The life debt story seemed plausible, but something about it didn't quite fit with the ruthlessly pragmatic man she had met. The Duke was not one for sentimentality or honoring ancient promises. If Lady Agatha was to be believed, there had to be more to it. Almost exactly 1 month after their wedding, word arrived that the Duke of Westmoreland was returning to London. The household was thrown into a flurry of activity, with every surface polished to gleaming perfection and every meal planned with military precision. Clara found herself unaccountably nervous, changing her gown 3 times before settling on a simple but elegant creation of emerald silk that complemented her auburn hair. She was in the library, reviewing household accounts, when she heard the commotion in the entrance hall that signaled his arrival. She rose to greet him, expecting the same cold, distant man who had left on their wedding day. Instead, the figure that strode into the library seemed different somehow, still imposing and serious, but there was a new tension in the set of his shoulders, a wariness in his eyes as they swept over her. "Your Grace," she curtsied. "Welcome home." For a long moment he simply looked at her, as if searching for something in her face. "You're still here," he finally said, an odd note in his voice that Clara couldn't quite decipher. She raised an eyebrow. "Did you expect me to be elsewhere? You did make me your duchess, after all." The Duke moved to the sideboard and poured himself a measure of brandy, his back to her. "I had reports that you've been managing the household admirably in my absence," he said, not answering her question. "Lady Agatha writes that you've already resolved the staffing issues in the country estate and reorganized the charitable accounts to be more efficient." He turned to face her, raising his glass in a small salute. "Well done." Clara was so startled by the unexpected praise that she momentarily forgot her composure. "Thank you," she said, then added more boldly, "though I imagine your real concern is whether I've embarrassed you in society." The Duke's expression darkened. "I've heard about the incident with Lady Edith." Clara's heart sank. Of course Lady Edith would have found a way to turn their encounter against her. She braced herself for his anger, but what he said next surprised her even more. "James tells me you handled her admirably." "Good. The woman is a viper dressed in silk. I've never liked her." Clara couldn't help the small laugh that escaped her. "That is not what I expected you to say, Your Grace. I was given to understand she was your preferred choice for a bride." The Duke drained his glass and set it down with more force than necessary. "Given to understand by whom? Idle gossips with nothing better to do than speculate on matters they know nothing about?" He ran a hand through his copper hair, a gesture that seemed oddly vulnerable. "Lady Edith was my mother's choice, not mine. Before she died, my mother extracted a promise from me to consider the match when I came of age. I considered it, found the lady lacking in every quality I value, and moved on. Society apparently did not." Clara studied him curiously. "And what qualities do you value, Your Grace?" For the first time since she had met him, Alexander Harrington appeared slightly discomfited. "Honesty," he said after a pause. "Intelligence, resilience, the courage to speak one's mind, even when it's difficult." His eyes met hers, intense and searching, rare qualities in society, particularly among marriage-minded young ladies. Before Clara could respond, the Duke abruptly changed the subject, asking about specific estate matters and household affairs. The moment of unexpected candor had passed, replaced by the business-like Duke she was more familiar with. Yet something had shifted between them. A crack in the ice, perhaps, or the first tentative step toward understanding. That night at dinner, served in the formal dining room despite it being just the two of them, Clara noticed the Duke watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. His gaze wasn't cold or assessing, as it had been before, but curious, almost puzzled. When she asked about his business in Scotland, he surprised her by answering in detail, describing the challenges of modernizing an inherited shipyard and the resistance he'd faced from workers accustomed to older methods. Clara found herself genuinely interested, asking questions about manufacturing techniques that seemed to surprise and please him. "You understand business matters," he remarked. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Clara nodded. "My father may have been a poor steward of his own affairs, but he believed daughters should be educated as thoroughly as sons. I helped manage our household accounts from the age of 16. A shadow crossed her face. Not that it mattered in the end. No amount of careful accounting could offset his gambling losses. The Duke studied her for a moment. "Your father's failings are not yours," he said quietly, "just as my father's virtues are not mine. We each make our own way." It was the closest thing to comfort anyone had offered Clara about her father's disgrace, and it touched her more deeply than she cared to admit. Later that week, the Duke announced they would attend Lord and Lady Pembroke's ball together, their first public appearance as a married couple. Clara spent hours preparing, knowing all of London society would be scrutinizing her every move. The gown she selected was a masterpiece of pale gold silk with delicate embroidery at the bodice, modest enough to be proper, but elegant enough to befit her new station. When she descended the grand staircase, the Duke was waiting in the entrance hall, resplendent in formal evening wear, his copper hair gleaming in the candlelight. For the briefest moment, something like appreciation flickered in his eyes before his usual mask of reserve fell back into place. The Pembroke ball was everything Clara had feared. Curious stares, whispered comments behind fans, and the occasional outright snub from those who deemed her unworthy of her title. She held her head high and smiled through it all, but each slight was a fresh wound to her still fragile confidence. The Duke remained by her side more than she had expected, steering her skillfully through the dangerous waters of the Ton with a possessive hand at the small of her back. When Lady Edith approached, clearly intent on causing mischief, the Duke surprised Clara by smoothly intercepting, leading his wife to the dance floor before the blonde could reach them. "You dance well, Your Grace," Clara commented as they moved through the steps of a waltz. The Duke's hand was warm and steady against her waist, his movements surprisingly graceful for such a powerful man. "Alexander," he said unexpectedly. Clara looked up at him, confused. "When we are alone or in circumstances like these, you may call me Alexander. Your Grace from my wife's lips seems excessive." Clara couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her mouth. "Very well, Alexander. And you may call me Clara if you wish." He nodded once, the barest hint of an answering smile touching his lips before disappearing. The evening might have continued pleasantly had Viscount Townsend, a notorious gossip with a cruel streak, not intercepted them as they left the dance floor. "Your Grace," he bowed to the Duke, pointedly ignoring Clara. "What a surprise to see you in attendance. I had heard you were in mourning for your bachelor status, unexpectedly cut short as it was." Several nearby conversations hushed, people straining to hear the Duke's response. Alexander's expression hardened, his eyes becoming chips of ice. "Viscount," he acknowledged coldly, "your information is, as usual, incorrect. I am celebrating my good fortune in securing a wife who enhances both my home and my standing, something I understand you have yet to accomplish, despite your advancing years and declining fortune." Gasps rippled through the crowd at the Duke's cutting response. The Viscount flushed crimson, sputtering indignantly, but Alexander had already turned away, guiding Clara toward a less populated corner of the ballroom. "I apologize for that," he said quietly, once they were relatively private. "Townsend has always been a vindictive fool." Clara looked up at her husband, seeing him in a new light. "You defended me," she said, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. Alexander's expression was inscrutable. "You are my duchess," he replied simply. "An attack on you is an attack on me, and I do not tolerate attacks." Yet there was something in his tone, a thread of genuine anger that suggested his defense had been more than just a matter of pride or position. On the carriage ride home, Clara gathered her courage to ask a question that had been troubling her since her conversation with James. "Why did you really marry me, Alexander? It wasn't for my father's shipping routes. You knew those were already lost. It wasn't for my family connections or fortune, as I have neither. So why?" For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. He stared out the carriage window at the passing London streets, his profile sharp against the darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and reflective. "I saw you once before we were introduced, at Lady Harrington's garden party last spring. You were helping a servant boy who had tripped and spilled a tray of drinks. While everyone else was either laughing at his misfortune or pretending not to notice, you knelt down in your fine dress to help him gather the broken glass, speaking to him kindly all the while." He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the dim light from the carriage lamps. "Later that same afternoon, I overheard you defending a wallflower from Lady Edith's cruel remarks. You didn't know the girl, had no reason to champion her, yet you did so without hesitation, risking social censure." Clara remembered both incidents, but was astonished that the Duke had noticed, let alone remembered them. "When your father approached me about his debts, invoking the life debt my father owed him, I saw an opportunity," Alexander continued. "Society would accept our marriage as a nobleman honoring an old obligation. You would be spared the disgrace of your father's actions. And he hesitated. "I would have a wife with qualities I had observed and admired." It seemed a rational solution. Clara studied his face, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. "Is that all?" she pressed gently. Alexander shifted uncomfortably, unused to such personal questioning. "When I was 15 and suddenly a duke, responsible for estates I barely understood, and a brother who had just lost his parents, kindness was in short supply," he admitted. "I learned quickly that in our world it is the rarest of commodities, particularly when offered without expectation of return. I value it more than beauty, more than accomplishments, more than connections." He met her gaze directly. "I married you, Clara, because you are kind when you have no reason to be, strong when you have every excuse to break, and honest when lies would serve you better. Those are qualities worthy of a duchess, worthy of admiration." Clara felt her heart flutter at his words, not a declaration of love by any means, but perhaps something equally precious from this complex, guarded man: respect. The remainder of the journey passed in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before, charged with awareness and possibility rather than cold distance. As weeks turned to months, a tentative friendship developed between the Duke and Duchess of Westmoreland. Clara discovered that Alexander, for all his stern demeanor, possessed a dry wit that occasionally surfaced in private moments. Alexander found that Clara's natural charm and genuine concern for others made her an effective hostess, and a valuable ally in navigating social obligations he had always despised. They developed a routine of breakfast together each morning, discussing household matters and sharing observations about London society. In the evenings, they often retired to the library, where Clara would read while Alexander worked through correspondence, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. Yet there remained a distance between them, physical and emotional, that neither seemed ready to bridge. Alexander still retreated to his private chambers each night, maintaining the separate lives he had promised in their original agreement. Clara never pressed for more, though she increasingly found herself wondering what it would be like if their marriage were real in all aspects, not just on paper. The true test of their evolving relationship came unexpectedly on a rainy autumn afternoon. Clara was returning from visiting a charity school, supported by Westmoreland funds, when her carriage was involved in an accident on a slippery street. Though not seriously injured, she suffered a sprained wrist and several bruises, enough to confine her to bed for a few days on the doctor's orders. She had been dozing fitfully when her bedroom door burst open, and Alexander strode in, still wearing his greatcoat, rainwater dripping from his hair and shoulders. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "Are you all right?" He crossed to her bedside in 2 long strides, his eyes scanning her for injuries, his hand reaching out as if to touch her face, before stopping just short. "Alexander," she said, surprised by his intensity. "I'm fine, truly. Just a sprained wrist and some bruises. The doctor says I'll be fully recovered in a week or so." Relief washed over his features, followed quickly by anger. "I'll have that carriage driver dismissed immediately. Reckless fool, taking a corner at that speed in the rain. He might have killed you." Clara caught his hand, surprising both of them with the contact. "It wasn't Thomas's fault," she explained gently. "A child ran into the street after a ball. Thomas swerved to avoid hitting him and clipped a lamppost. If anything, he deserves commendation for his quick thinking." Alexander looked down at her hand on his, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "You could have been killed," he repeated, his voice softer now but no less intense. Clara felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with her injuries or the blankets covering her. "But I wasn't," she assured him. "I'm right here, Alexander, a little battered but very much alive." Impulsively, she squeezed his hand. To her surprise, he returned the pressure, his fingers curling around hers. After that day, something shifted between them again. Alexander began finding reasons to touch Clara, offering his arm more often, letting his hand linger at her waist when guiding her through a room, standing closer than strictly necessary when they spoke. Clara, in turn, found herself seeking his company more actively, suggesting walks in the garden or carriage rides in the park. They began to present not just the appearance of a united couple in public, but the reality of one in private as well. Society noted the change. The whispers about their marriage of convenience gradually gave way to speculation about a genuine love match, especially after Alexander was observed gazing at his wife during Lady Harrington's Christmas ball with what one dowager countess described as positively indecent adoration. Yet still, Alexander maintained that final barrier between them, retiring to his own chambers each night, though his good-night wishes grew warmer, his reluctance to leave more apparent. Clara, raised to believe a lady never pursued a gentleman, even her own husband, waited patiently, hoping Alexander would eventually bridge the gap himself. What she didn't know was that Alexander was fighting his own battle, between the control he had maintained all his adult life and the growing desire to fully claim the woman who had become essential to his happiness. The situation came to a head on a snowy January evening, 6 months into their marriage. They had attended a concert at which Clara had been particularly admired in a new gown of deep burgundy velvet. Throughout the evening, Alexander had noticed other men watching his wife, her beauty, grace, and genuine warmth attracting attention from all quarters. One young earl had been particularly persistent, engaging Clara in conversation whenever Alexander was momentarily distracted. Though Clara had been nothing but proper, Alexander had felt an unfamiliar emotion burning in his chest, jealousy, an alien sensation for a man who had prided himself on his logical approach to all matters. Upon returning home, the tension that had been building between them for months finally snapped. As Clara removed her gloves in the entrance hall, Alexander stopped her with a hand on her wrist. "Do you find the Earl of Blackwood's company enjoyable?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, though his eyes were stormy. Clara looked up at him in surprise. "Lord Blackwood, he's pleasant enough, I suppose. A bit dull, actually." She studied Alexander's face curiously. "Why do you ask?" Alexander released her wrist, stepping back as if to regain his composure. "He couldn't take his eyes off you all evening," he said stiffly. "Not that I blame him. You were the most beautiful woman there." The compliment, delivered in such a matter-of-fact tone, caught Clara off guard. In 6 months of marriage, Alexander had never directly commented on her appearance. "Thank you," she said softly, watching emotions war across his usually controlled features. "But I wasn't aware you noticed such things." Alexander's laugh was short and humorless. "I notice everything about you, Clara. That's the problem." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she now recognized as a sign of internal struggle. "I notice the way the sunlight turns your hair to fire in the morning. I notice how your eyes crinkle at the corners when you're truly amused rather than just being polite. I notice that you bite your lower lip when you're concentrating on household accounts. I notice everything, and it's driving me mad because I promised you a marriage of convenience, not this." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. "This?" she echoed, taking a step toward him. "What is this, Alexander?" He stood his ground, though she could see the tension in every line of his body. "Wanting," he admitted, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Wanting what I have no right to ask for. Wanting more than our arrangement allows." Clara took another step closer, close enough now to feel the warmth radiating from him. "Perhaps," she suggested, her own voice soft but steady. "You should ask anyway. The worst I can do is say no." Alexander's eyes, those winter sky eyes that had once seemed so cold, now burned with undisguised longing. "Clara," he said, her name like a prayer on his lips, "I want a real marriage, not just in name, not just in public, but in every way. I want you as my wife, my partner, my everything." He took a shaky breath. "I never expected this, never planned for it, but somewhere between that first meeting in the library and tonight, you've become necessary to me. I think I've fallen in love with you." Clara's breath caught at the naked vulnerability in his confession. This proud, controlled man was laying his heart at her feet, asking for what he clearly believed he might be denied. She reached up, placing her palm against his cheek. "Alexander Harrington," she said, using his full name for the first time. "The most infuriating, complex, honorable man I have ever known. Did it never occur to you that I might feel the same way?" For a moment he stood frozen, disbelief warring with hope in his expression. Then, with a groan of surrender, Alexander pulled Clara into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was nothing like the brief cold touch that had sealed their wedding vows. This was a kiss of passion and promise, of months of suppressed desire, finally given freedom. Clara melted against him, her arms twining around his neck as she returned his kiss with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Alexander pressed his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the first time I saw you standing in my library. Chin up, eyes flashing defiance despite your circumstances," he admitted. Clara smiled, feeling happier than she had in years. "And I've wanted you to do that since, well, not quite that long," she teased gently. "You were rather intimidating at first, but certainly since you defended me at the Pembroke ball." Alexander laughed, a free, joyous sound she had never heard from him before. "It seems we've both been waiting for the other to make the first move," Alexander said, brushing a strand of hair from Clara's face with tender care. "What a waste of precious time." He took her hand, raising it to his lips. "Come, it's late. Allow me to escort you to your chambers." Clara felt a moment of disappointment, thinking he still meant to maintain their separate sleeping arrangements, but as they reached her door, Alexander hesitated. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I don't wish to presume, but may I stay with you tonight? Not for, that is, I simply wish to hold you, to wake beside you tomorrow morning, and know this wasn't a dream." Clara's heart swelled at the unexpected vulnerability in this proud man's request. "Yes," she answered simply, opening her door and leading him inside. That night marked the true beginning of their marriage. Alexander held Clara in his arms as they talked for hours, sharing secrets and dreams they had never before voiced aloud. Clara learned that beneath his stern exterior lay a man of deep passions and carefully guarded tenderness. Alexander discovered that Clara's strength was matched by a profound capacity for forgiveness and understanding. When they finally drifted to sleep, it was with the peaceful certainty that they had found in each other not just a suitable match, but a perfect complement. Spring brought new beginnings to Westmoreland House. Clara, now fully embracing her role as Duchess, had transformed the once austere mansion into a warm home. Gardens that had lain neglected for years bloomed with carefully selected flowers. Windows that had been perpetually shuttered now stood open to admit sunshine and fresh air, and rooms that had echoed with emptiness now resonated with conversation and even occasional laughter. Society, always quick to follow the lead of those in power, had adjusted its collective opinion. The Duchess of Westmoreland was now considered a success story rather than a scandal. the perfect example of a woman rising to meet her station through grace and determination. Alexander, too, had changed. Though still formidable in business matters, he had softened in personal interactions. Servants no longer scattered at his approach, and even his business associates noted a new approachability in the once forbidding Duke. Lady Agatha, visiting from her country estate, observed these changes with undisguised delight. "You've worked miracles, my dear," she told Clara, as they took tea in the newly refurbished garden room. "I haven't seen Alexander smile this much since he was a boy." Clara blushed, setting down her teacup. "He has changed me as well," she admitted. "I never thought I would find happiness after my father's disgrace, yet here I am, happier than I ever imagined possible." Lady Agatha patted her hand affectionately. "That's what a good marriage does, my dear. It transforms both parties into their better selves." She hesitated, then added with a twinkle in her eye, "Speaking of transformation, when do you plan to tell Alexander about the baby?" Clara gasped, her hand flying to her still flat stomach. "How did you know? I've only just confirmed it myself." Lady Agatha chuckled. "My dear, I've lived long enough to recognize the signs. The way you've been avoiding certain foods, that particular glow about you, and you've touched your stomach unconsciously at least a dozen times since we sat down." Her expression softened. "Alexander will be overjoyed. He may not show it in conventional ways, but becoming a father will mean everything to him." That evening, as they sat together in the library, Alexander reviewing correspondence, Clara embroidering by the fire, she gathered her courage. "Alexander," she began, setting aside her needlework, "there's something I must tell you." He looked up immediately, attuned now to every nuance of her voice. "What is it, love? You look serious." He set down his papers, giving her his full attention. Clara crossed to his chair, taking his hand and placing it gently against her abdomen. "We're going to have a child," she said softly, watching his face for his reaction. For a moment, Alexander simply stared at his hand on her stomach, his expression unreadable. Then, to Clara's surprise, she saw his eyes fill with tears, the first she had ever witnessed from this controlled man. "A child," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Our child." He stood suddenly, gathering Clara into his arms with such care, as if she had become infinitely precious and fragile in the space of a moment. "Are you certain? Are you well? Do you need anything?" The questions tumbled out, revealing the depth of his concern and joy. Clara laughed, cupping his face in her hands. "Yes, I'm certain. Yes, I'm perfectly well. And all I need is exactly what I have. You here with me, happy about this news." Alexander kissed her then, a kiss full of tenderness and promise. "I never thought to be this fortunate," he confessed, his forehead resting against hers. "To have found you, to have earned your love somehow, and now to create a family together. It's more than I dared hope for." He placed his hand once more on her stomach, wonder written across his features. "Our child will have everything I didn't. Two parents who love each other, who will be there to guide and protect them, who will teach them that there are more important things in life than duty and obligation." "Like what?" Clara asked, curious about what this man, who had been shaped so strongly by duty, now valued above it. Alexander's smile was gentle as he answered. "Like kindness, compassion, the courage to be vulnerable. All the things you've taught me, my love." He brushed his lips against her forehead. "Our child will know from the beginning what took me far too long to learn, that love is not a weakness, but the greatest strength of all." The months of Clara's pregnancy brought more changes to Westmoreland House and its master. Alexander became almost obsessively protective, reviewing the household staff to ensure only the most capable would attend his wife, consulting multiple physicians to guarantee the best care, and even researching childbirth and infant care himself, an unprecedented action for a nobleman of his station. When Clara gently teased him about his overprotectiveness, he responded with uncharacteristic humility. "I know I'm being ridiculous," he admitted, as they walked slowly through the garden, his arm supporting her as her pregnancy advanced. "But I cannot help it. You and this child are everything to me now. The thought of any harm coming to either of you—" He shook his head, unable to complete the sentence. Clara squeezed his arm reassuringly. "We are both healthy and strong. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, Alexander. Try to trust that all will be well." He nodded, though the worry didn't entirely leave his eyes. "I have something to show you," he said, changing the subject as he guided her toward a part of the house she seldom visited. "It's been a project of mine these past weeks." They stopped before a door in the family wing, which Alexander opened with a slightly nervous gesture. "I hope you approve." Clara stepped into what had once been an unused sitting room and gasped in delight. Alexander had transformed it into a nursery, Not the austere, practical space typical of aristocratic households where children were largely raised by nurses and governesses, but a warm, inviting room clearly designed for parents who intended to be actively involved in their child's life. The walls had been painted a soft cream, the windows hung with cheerful yellow curtains that brightened the space. A magnificently carved cradle stood in the center of the room. Beside it, a comfortable rocking chair with embroidered cushions. Bookshelves already filled with children's stories lined one wall, and handcrafted toys were arranged artfully on low tables. "Alexander," Clara breathed, turning in a circle to take it all in. "It's perfect. Absolutely perfect." He relaxed visibly at her approval. "I had help," he admitted. Lady Agatha offered advice, and James contributed some of the toys. Apparently he's been secretly carving them for months, the sentimental fool. But his tone when speaking of his brother held nothing but affection. "I wanted our child to have a room filled with warmth and love, not duty and tradition." Clara moved to the cradle, running her fingers over the intricate carvings of woodland animals that decorated its sides. "Did you select this yourself?" Alexander nodded, coming to stand beside her. "It was made by a craftsman in Scotland, the son of a man who worked in our shipyards. When I mentioned during my visit that I hoped to have a family someday, he showed me his work. I commissioned it that day, hoping—" He shrugged, slightly embarrassed. "Hoping that someday you might care for me enough to make that hope a reality." Clara turned to him, eyes shining with tears of happiness. "Even then, you were thinking of children, with me." Alexander's smile was tender as he wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "Even then," he confirmed, "though I scarcely dared admit it, even to myself. The moment I saw you standing in my library, proud despite your circumstances, I began to hope for things I had long since abandoned: companionship, understanding, family, love." He placed his hand gently on her rounded belly. "And now, miracle of miracles, all those hopes have been realized." As Clara's time grew near, Alexander rearranged his entire schedule to remain close to home. Business matters that would normally have required his personal attention were delegated to trusted associates. Social obligations were politely but firmly declined. His entire focus narrowed to Clara's well-being and comfort, to the point where even James teased him about his devotion. "If anyone had told me a year ago that my stern, duty-obsessed brother would become this lovesick, anxious, expectant father, I'd have laughed in their face," James commented during one of his frequent visits. "You've accomplished what I thought impossible, Clara. You've made Alexander human again." The birth, when it finally came on a warm June evening, was difficult but ultimately joyful. Alexander, breaking with all aristocratic tradition, refused to leave the house during Clara's labor, pacing the hallway outside the birthing chamber like a caged lion, deaf to Lady Agatha's assurances that all was proceeding normally. When the doctor finally emerged to announce the birth of a healthy son, Alexander nearly collapsed with relief. "May I see them?" he asked, his usually authoritative voice reduced to an anxious whisper. The doctor, amused by this uncharacteristic behavior from the formidable Duke, nodded his permission. "Her Grace is tired but well. Both she and the child are remarkably strong." Alexander barely heard the rest, already pushing past the doctor into the room where Clara lay propped against pillows, a tiny bundle cradled in her arms. "Alexander," she smiled up at him, tired but radiant, "come meet your son." He approached the bed almost reverently, his eyes fixed on the small face just visible among the swaddling clothes. When Clara held out the baby to him, Alexander hesitated. "I don't know how," he admitted, uncharacteristic uncertainty in his voice. Clara's smile deepened. "Sit here." She patted the bed beside her. "Support his head in the crook of your arm. Yes, like that. There, you're a natural." Alexander stared down at his son's face in wonder. The tiny nose, the rosebud mouth, the wisp of copper hair that proclaimed his parentage. "He's perfect," he whispered, one finger gently tracing the baby's cheek. "Utterly perfect." He looked up at Clara, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "Thank you. For him. For everything. I never knew I could feel this. Complete." They named the boy James Alexander Harrington, in honor of both his uncle and his father. Young James proved to be a healthy, vigorous baby, with his mother's green eyes and his father's determined chin. To the astonishment of their social circle, the Duke of Westmoreland could often be found in the nursery, holding his son, reading to him, or simply watching him sleep. The man who had once been known for his rigid adherence to duty and tradition now willingly set aside important correspondence to rock his fussing son to sleep or to bring his exhausted wife a cup of tea. "I never thought marriage and fatherhood would suit me," Alexander confessed to Clara one evening as they sat together in the nursery, watching their son sleep peacefully in his cradle. I saw them as obligations to be fulfilled, nothing more. How wrong I was. He took Clara's hand, raising it to his lips. You have given me far more than an heir, my love. You've given me a life worth living, a heart capable of feeling something beyond duty. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible during those dark days after her father's death. And you have given me everything I thought lost forever. Security, respect, purpose, love. She turned to look up at him, her eyes reflecting the depth of her feelings. We saved each other, I think. Indeed, Alexander agreed, his arm tightening around her shoulders, though I suspect I received the better part of the bargain. As the years passed, the Duke and Duchess of Westmoreland became one of the most respected and admired couples in London society. Their home was known for its warmth and welcome, a stark contrast to the cold formality that had once characterized Westmoreland House. They added to their family a daughter, Elizabeth Agatha, born 2 years after young James, followed by another son, William, 3 years later. All 3 children grew up surrounded by love and guidance, with parents who were actively involved in their upbringing, despite the prevailing fashion for aristocratic detachment. Alexander remained a formidable figure in business and politics, but those closest to him recognized the profound changes wrought by his marriage. The cold, duty-bound Duke had given way to a man of passion and principle, still commanding respect, but now inspiring loyalty and even affection as well. Clara, once pitied as the destitute daughter forced into a marriage of convenience, was now admired for her grace, her charitable work, and her obvious happiness. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Alexander surprised Clara with a private celebration in the same library where they had first met. Candles illuminated the space, casting a warm glow over the room that had witnessed the beginning of their unlikely journey together. A small table had been set with champagne and her favorite foods, and a velvet box sat beside her place setting. "What's this?" Clara asked, touching the box with curious fingers. Alexander smiled, the smile that even after a decade of marriage still made her heart skip a beat. "Open it and see." Inside lay a sapphire and diamond necklace that perfectly matched the ring he had placed on her finger on their wedding day, the ring she had once thought a cold symbol of a business transaction, but now cherished as the beginning of her greatest happiness. "It's beautiful," she breathed, lifting the necklace from its velvet nest. Alexander took it from her hands, moving behind her to fasten it around her neck, his fingers lingering against her skin. "Not half as beautiful as you," he murmured, pressing a kiss to the sensitive spot just below her ear. "Not half as precious to me as every day of these 10 years has been." He turned her gently to face him, his winter sky eyes now warm with love and memories. "Do you remember what I told you that first night, when we finally acknowledged what was growing between us?" Clara nodded, her own eyes misty with happiness. "You said I had become necessary to you. That somewhere between our first meeting and that night, you had fallen in love with me." Alexander smiled, taking both her hands in his. "I was wrong," he said, making Clara's heart skip a beat until he continued. "Not about loving you, never that, but about when it happened." He raised one hand to cup her cheek tenderly. "I fell in love with you the moment you walked into this library, chin held high despite your circumstances, refusing to be cowed by adversity or by me. I just didn't recognize it then. I didn't know what love felt like." "And now?" Clara asked softly, leaning into his touch. Alexander's smile deepened, the smile that only she and their children ever saw, full of tenderness and vulnerability and joy. "Now I know it feels like coming home," he answered simply. "Like finding the piece of yourself you never knew was missing until it was there. Like waking up each morning grateful for another day because it means another day with you." He drew her close, his forehead resting against hers in the gesture of intimacy that had become their own private language of love. "Thank you, my Clara, for teaching the cruel Duke how to love, for making me beg for your love, and then, miracle of miracles, for giving it to me freely." Clara wrapped her arms around his neck, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain such happiness. "It was never a matter of learning for you, Alexander. The capacity to love was always there, buried beneath duty and pain and fear. All I did was help you find it again." She kissed him then, a kiss as full of passion and promise as their first had been a decade earlier. "And as for giving you my love, it has been the easiest, most natural thing I have ever done, the only thing, in fact, that has ever felt truly inevitable. In the years that followed, the story of the Duke and Duchess of Westmoreland became something of a legend in London society, how the cold, forbidding Duke had married the disgraced Baron's daughter out of duty, only to discover in her arms the love and happiness he had never known he needed, how the forced marriage of convenience had transformed into one of the great love matches of the era. It was a story told to hopeful debutantes and cynical bachelors alike, a reminder that even in their world of calculation and advantage, genuine love could still flourish in the most unexpected places. And in their private moments, alone in the library where it all began, Alexander and Clara would sometimes marvel at the strange turns of fate that had brought them together. Her father's disgrace, his sense of obligation, a chance observation at a garden party years before. "We should have been miserable," Clara would say, nestled in the circle of her husband's arms before the fire. "All the elements were there for a disastrous match." "Perhaps," Alexander would answer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Or perhaps some souls are simply meant to find each other, no matter what obstacles lie in their path." And Clara, looking up into the face of the man who had once been called the cruelest duke in England, but who now gazed at her with undisguised adoration, could only agree. For what else but destiny could have transformed their beginning of duty and resignation into this life of profound and enduring love? The story of Alexander and Clara Harrington, Duke and Duchess of Westmoreland, would be told for generations. How a marriage forced by circumstance became one of choice, of devotion, of deep and abiding love. How a cold heart learned not just to feel again, but to cherish that feeling above all else. How duty gave way to desire and obligation to passion. It was a reminder that love could be found in the most unlikely places, that hearts could change when they found their perfect match, and that sometimes the very thing we believe will be our greatest burden turns out to be our greatest blessing. And whenever they told the story, they always ended it the same way, with the cruel Duke on his knees, not in supplication or shame, but in profound gratitude for the woman who had taught him that love was not a weakness to be feared, but the greatest strength a person could possess. "If I had to do it all again," Alexander would tell Clara in their quiet moments together, "if I had to relive every moment of pain and loneliness that led me to you, I would do so gladly. For you, my love, have been worth every step of the journey." This was no ordinary love story, no simple tale of hearts and flowers. It was a story of transformation, of a cold heart warmed, of a broken spirit mended, of two souls finding in each other not just companionship, but completion. It was the story of the cruel Duke of Westmoreland, who learned to beg for the love of the woman he had married out of duty, and of Clara Blackwood, who found in that begging not triumph, but the greatest gift of her life, a love born of respect, nurtured by kindness, and destined to last beyond the boundaries of time itself. If you enjoyed this emotional journey through Victorian London, please leave a comment sharing what touched or surprised you most about Alexander and Clara's story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share if you'd like to experience more historical romances like this one. Thank you so much for listening, and another equally moving video will be suggested on your screen now.